of my favorite lectures because you get to see a lot of pictures and a lot of cool interactions. And it's typically things that you have seen before, so it should be more or less familiar to you. So we're going to start talking about species interactions, right? And so when we're thinking about talking about multiple species, right, we're going to talk about communities. And so communities are the assemblages of many populations that live in the same place at the same time. All right, so we talked about what is a species, what makes a species. We talked about a population and population dynamics. Closed captioning, right? Yep. Thank you for putting your hand up. I would not have remembered. Let's see. All right, so we talked about all these different factors around populations, density, demography, and so on and so forth, right? But we have not talked about communities yet. And so we're going to talk about interactions that can happen when many species are together in the same area. All right, so we can get interactions, and these interactions can vary quite widely. All right, so we can get competition. Right, competition is a pretty common interaction. Right, on the image up here, I'm showing you competition for space for these different species of barnacles. So in this species, or in this image here, there's a little bit of space left. Right, but all the different species of barnacles are competing for that last little bit of space. We'll expand upon this. Oh, we might have our students.
Sorry,
Oh, yes, definitely. Come on in. Hi, nice to meet you. Yeah. Let's see. Go ahead and take a seat. We just got started, so you have not missed much. All right, so we're looking at competition. Right, another type of interaction might be a mutualism. Right, so both parties are going to benefit. Like in the case of a hummingbird and a flower, right? Hummingbird gets the nectar, the flower gets pollinated. Another type of interaction might be parasitism. Right, so when one species is going to parasitize another species. We might also get pathogens, right? So pathogens invading the body of another organism, whether that's plants like I have shown you up here, or it could be in the form of like a virus or infection in some animal species. We can have predation, right? So we're predating upon other species that are around us for food, and herbivory. Right? So herbivory happens between plants and an organism that eats the plants. All right, so depending on what these interactions are, they're either going to be beneficial, they're going to be harmful, or they might be kind of neutral to both parties. So competition is going to be negative to both species. Right? One species is using a resource, which then decreases the amount of resources for another species. We can have predation, herbivory, and parasitism. These are all examples of how it's negative for one species, positive for the other. Right? So the species doing the eating or doing the parasitizing, right? They are benefiting, right? But the species being eaten, right? Those plants, those animals that are being killed, right? They definitely have a negative consequence associated with them. They can be mutualism, like we talked about for the hummingbird or the flower, where both species are going to benefit. Or it could be commensalism, right, which is a little less common. It's positive for one, right, but has absolutely no effect on the other species. And we'll talk about that at the end of the lecture today. We're going to start with looking at competition. All right. So competition, we have to once again identify what is a niche. All right. I say niche, some other inspectors might say niche, right? I prefer niche, I don't know, personal preference. But if you remember, right, we talked about what a niche is, and that's the sum total of all ways that species are going to utilize their environment, right? Whether that's space, food, nesting spaces, mating conditions, how they might, or different abiotic factors like temperature and moisture that they might require to live, right? Any way that they interact with their environment would be their niche. Now, competition is going to occur when individuals use at least some of the same resources, right? Or when their niches start to overlap, right? So then competition, one organism is using that resource, which decreases the number of resources for that other organism. So if we look at an example here, this theoretical example, we have one species, right, in blue here, right, and this curve is representing the number of seeds consumed. And on the bottom axis here, we have seed size. And we can see for this particular species in blue, they prefer kind of the median range of seed size, right? Kind of this intermediate size, right? Maybe they physically don't have mouths big enough to eat the bigger seeds, right? Something is limiting them from eating those big size seeds, right? But if we introduce another species into this environment, right, our niches are going to start to overlap, right? So species 2, in red here, right, they prefer the bigger seeds, right? So there's no competition for the biggest of seeds. But there's going to be competition here where we see overlap, right? Kind of for these larger intermediate sized seeds, right? We're going to get competition because they're both fighting for the same resource. All right, there's different types of competition, right? There can be intra-specific competition, right? So this is competition within a population, within the same species, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about population dynamics, right? Resources in an environment can only provide resources for a set number of individuals. It's density dependent. The more individuals you have, the more resources you're going to need, and eventually you're going to butt up against that density of the environment. A lot of what we'll be talking about in lecture today, because we're talking about communities and species interactions, is interspecific competition. Right? So I like to remember the differences because it's very subtle, like intraspecific versus interspecific. I think of as inter-differs, right? That's kind of how I remember that mnemonic. Right there, go ahead and take a seat. So interspecies is competition between different species. And really what we're going to focus on. So we're going to look at this experiment done in the 1930s by a Russian scientist, Grigory Gosse, who worked with 3 different paramecium species. So paramecium species are single-celled organisms here. He worked with these 3 that I have shown you up above. And the first thing that he did was grew them alone, right? Grew them separated out from one another, and just look to see their population structure, right? They look to see, do they have exponential growth? Do they have logistic growth, right? And for each of those paramecium species, we see that we tend to get this plateau after it's been grown for a while, right? So what type of growth pattern would this indicate? Exponential or logistic? Yeah, logistic, right? For each of them, they're starting to reach the carrying capacity of their environment, right? So each of these started to plateau, right? So each grew logistically, right? And I think I actually gave this to you, so yes, kudos for you for picking up on that and knowing the answer. Yes. Yeah. So if you didn't see this population, say we stopped this experiment at 8 days, you might see exponential growth because it just hasn't been prepared yet. Yep. All right. But then he took it a step further, and he grew these 2 paramecium species together in the same environment to see what would happen. All right. So only 2 of these species. One was the caudatum, one was the aurora. Right? And what he saw was that this red species grew pretty much the same, right? Plateaued out, right? Just like you saw when they grew by themselves. But for this green species, this caudatum species here, we see exponential growth at first, but then this population starts to decline. Right? So what we're seeing here is a really great example of competitive exclusion. Right? One species is excluding the other. So one species is using up all the resources, leaving none for the others. Right? So then this scientist grew 2 different paramecium species together, right? And once again looked at how they grew in the same environment together. Right? And what he saw was represented in this graph here. This green had a little bit of a higher growth than this blue species. Do we see evidence of competition here? Not really, right? Because if we look at how they grew individually, we see that just naturally, this species in blue, this Bursaria, right, just has a lower population size just by itself, right? So even though it's lower than this green species, right, that's to be expected, right? So this would be evidence of coexistence, two species that can coexist together. Right? Now obviously they're using the same resources, so how can they coexist? By using this competition? Well, this has to do with resource partition. Right? So this is where you have a differentiation of those niches. Essentially, you're partitioning out the resources within each of the niches. Right? And that way, that enables many species to live together in a community. Right? Another researcher that did an experiment that kind of gave us evidence for this research partitioning was Robert MacArthur. Right? He examined the coexistence between 5 different species of warblers, right, these birds, and he looked at where they lived within spruce trees within New England. Right? And what he found is that even though they live in the same tree, right, so they have that same environment, within that environment, they're kind of partitioning out where they live and what they use for their resources. So some of these species, right, they lived higher up on this spruce tree versus other species lived further down, right? And they likely fed on a different variety of insects depending on where they lived. Yes? Yeah, this is likely the result of some sort of natural selection. Right, so species diverge to specialize in that particular niche. Yeah, good question. All right, so if we look at the outcomes of competition, right, there's 2 different outcomes. We can have competitive exclusion. So one species is just better at being a competitor, better at using those resources than the other. Right? That means that other species is not going to be able to survive with that species that's better at competing. Right? Or we can have coexistence, right, by means of resource partition. Right? Dividing out those resources so that there's more than one realized niche. Right? So niche isn't just a tree, but there's more than one realized niche by looking at different levels of that tree. Right? So we get this competitive exclusion principle. Right? If species are in competition and competitively excluding each other, excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words today. 2 species cannot coexist indefinitely together. So maybe at first they can live in the same environment. Right? Maybe at first they can potentially coexist to an extent, but after a while, one species is just going to be a better competitor, right, and use up the resources so that the other does not have it. Okay? And that resource that is used up is really variable depending on the environment. Right? It might be this physical environment, so the space that they are using. Right? Maybe it's different territories. If you think about wolves, they have these territories that they defend. Maybe it's nutrients or food availability. Right? Nutrient availability more for plants, right? Food availability for insects, for animals. And maybe it's just what predators are available, what predators might be present. Right? So, conclusion, right? Species with the same requirements cannot live together in the same place with the same resources. Right? They cannot occupy the same niche. All right, before we leave competition, I just want to conclude by saying competition is common. Right? And so when field studies are done, right? So field studies is where you go out in nature and do some sort of an experiment, some sort of a study, right? Make those observations. You see that when we have a single pair of species, so pair means 2, we have 2 different species here, competition is almost always going to be reported. Right? So in this image here, we have ants, we have beetles, right? They're competing for the resource of grains, right? And this resource spectrum is grain size, right? So ants prefer smaller grains, beetles prefer larger grains, And where they overlap in what they prefer, we get some competition. Right? The percentage of competition is going to vary depending on how many species you have and how they use their resources. Right? So if we expanded this out to include not only ants and beetles, but we also have mice and birds, right? We see that we get some competition wherever there is a niche overlap, right? But it depends on the species, depends on the resource, right? We don't have any competition between ants and birds, right? Because they're using two different resources. Very, very small grains or very, very large grains, right? They're not having any overlap, right? Plants tend to show a really high degree of competition, right? Plants, they can't move, they can't find other resources. Where they grow is where they're at, so they're really good at competing for resources. Marine organisms also tend to be really good at being able to compete for resources, especially if you think about like intertidal species. You think about the barnacles, that very first image I showed you on the slide, where they are competing for space. Right? There's only so many rocks on the shoreline that provide the space for them to grow. Right? So they're really good at competing for that space. All right, let's take a pause here. I want you to find an example of competition. Right? So use the internet, Google away. I want you to find an example and tell me, does this show interspecific or intraspecific competition? Right? And does it show coexistence or competitive exclusion? I'll ask for a couple of you to share what you find in just a couple of minutes here. Yes. Cool. So you might have to find a more specific example if you want to go to true examples, but it could be the adults are better at competing than the juveniles on forest floor. Or it could be that two different species, one species is taller. So in that example, so that's intraspecific competition. Why does it look like they're different plants? So intra means the same species, right? So I would expect those to be the same species. Yeah, so the same species. Any questions? Yeah. Good, because time just ran out. So I'm going to ask for people to share what they have found. So, Kendall, your hand up pretty fast here.
It's two species, or one species of two different types of snails that live on rocks. And yeah, they both feed on limestone, but they couldn't out compete each other, so it seems like exclude one another because they were so they end up being forced to coexist and
Okay. And they weren't using up the resources,
yeah.
so the other didn't have anything.
Yeah, they just didn't have enough need.
Yeah, so the intra-specific example of the same species that we use in different individuals. Yes. Yeah, corals, different species taking up different they'll completely overlap, right? Yeah. Yes, great example. Right? Competition over that. Any other examples you want to share? Okay, there are so many examples out there. Like I said, competition studies have shown that if two species are in the same area, it's about 90% certain that they will compete for something. All right. Any questions on competition? All right, we're going to move on to predation, herbivory, and parasitism. All right, so these categories are where one species is going to benefit, right? The other species is going to be harmed. Right? And we can classify each of these based on how lethal they are and the length of association between consumer and what's being consumed. Right? So first of all, we have herbivory. Right? So an animal is eating a plant. Right? The length of the duration is pretty low. Right? The length of the duration is literally the time it takes for an animal to take a bite out of the plant. Right? Maybe a second. Right? Lethality is also pretty low. Right? Likely that plant is going to recover and regrow based off of how much this herbivore took off of that plant. Right? Likely it's not going to be lethal. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have predation. Right? So a predator is going to feed on its prey. Right? The length of the interaction is still pretty low. Right? It doesn't take too long for a predator to kill a prey, but it's going to be highly lethal. Right? And so it's going to have a rapid death of that predator. Yes? How likely it is that they will die? Not necessarily, because plants have the ability to keep growing. Right? If they lose a blade of grass, they can just grow another one. Whereas if this predator is bleeding out and has a large chunk taken out of them, they're not going to be able to regenerate that part of their body. Right? All right. Some of the more interesting ones, at least what I think is interesting, parasitism. Right? So this is where a parasite is going to establish a long relationship with its host. So the length of the interaction is actually pretty long. Right? If you think about a tick on a deer, right? Or maybe you've had a tick on yourselves before, right? They're going to attach and stay put on the host, right? So it's going to establish a long relationship, but it's likely not going to lead to death, right? It can, but likely not going to be super lethal, right? So for example, once that tick gets still, it will fall off, right? Now this is different from parasitoidism, right? So this is different in that the organism is going to lay eggs on the host, right? Those eggs are going to hatch. Those larvae are going to stay on the host, likely eat the host, right? And that host is very likely going to die, right? So there's a long time of interaction, right? There's a long time between laying eggs hatching, larvae eating the host before that host actually dies, right? And that host is almost always going to die, so it's pretty lethal. All right, because we have these interactions occurring, right? One individual is benefiting, the other is being harmed. Right? Organisms have evolved many ways to defend themselves. Right? And so anti-predator defenses might include chemical defenses, camouflage, mimicry, intimidation, or armor and weaponry. Right? So we're going to look at examples of each. And this is what, like I said, makes this one of my favorite lectures, because we just get to look at so many different cool examples in nature. So chemical defenses, right? These are defenses where some sort of chemical is produced in order to deter a predator. An example of this would be the bombardier beetle. Right? It's actually going to eject this hot, stinging spray at anything that tries to attack it, right? So in this image up here, we actually have these tweezers or these forceps being the attacker here, right? And we can see this hot, stinging spray being ejected as a result. It could be aposematic coloration, right? In and of itself, it's not a chemical defense, but it's signaling to a predator that they do have these toxic components to them, right? So it's a warning coloration, right? It's advertising that I taste bad or I'm poisonous. Do not mess with me, right? So these poison dart frogs are a great example of this, right? Their skin is poisonous to the touch, right? Fun fact about the poison dart frogs, they're actually poisonous because of what they eat, right? If they don't have that certain diet, they will not be poisonous, right? So you can have, I worked in a university that had a lab with poison dart frogs that were not poisonous because they did not feed them the poisonous resource that made them poisonous. Right, a really common one around here, skunks. Right, you don't want to mess with a skunk because they have that chemical defense to them, and they will spray their predators to try to deter that from happening. Plants have really cool chemical defenses. Right? Some plants we would call these secondary metabolites. Right? And there would be any chemical that's synthesized to deter predation. Right? So nicotine, morphine, cocaine, caffeine, these are all secondary metabolites that the plants produce to protect themselves, even though individuals in the human population can exploit these secondary metabolites for their own use. Right? But in plants, they're not produced for humans, they're produced to deter herbivory from happening. Right? Another example of this would be latex. So the common milkweed here, you can see this in the coneflower prairie on campus. Right? If you were to break off a leaf, right, or cut a leaf in half, you're going to see this milky substance kind of exuding out of the leaves. Right? This is latex. Right? And for mammals or anything with a backbone, so anything that's a vertebrate, right, this can affect heart function. Right? This is highly toxic. Right? Caffeine is another example. So if you've never seen a coffee bean plant with the coffee beans on it, right, it looks very interesting here. Right? We actually have a coffee bean plant in the greenhouse upstairs that is currently producing coffee beans. Right? Greenhouse workers are hoping to someday get enough for just a single cup of coffee. So it's not nearly as prolific, right? But the caffeine, if it's ingested by insects, will paralyze them. Right? Jasmonic acid is another cool one. So jasmonic acid, it's not always produced, but when a plant senses that it's being eaten, it will synthesize this jasmonic acid, which acts like an insecticide for the plant. Right? But not only that, this jasmonic acid is released into the air, right? And other plants can see this jasmonic acid or sense this jasmonic acid and know that there are herbivores nearby. Right? So it's essentially signaling to other plants to say, hey, get ready, there are herbivores in the area. Right? Camouflage, right? This is pretty self-explanatory one here, like the seahorse in the marine environment, or the octopus underwater. Right? But even a lot of common animals, like an owl here, they're really good at blending into their environment. I don't know if you can see in that image there, but there's actually 3 different individuals up there. They are frogs that have this camouflage to look like decaying leaves. Right? And then we have this image down the bottom here. Can anybody spot the organism in that image? Yeah, it's a little cheetah. It's hiding. It's very camouflaged in the bush there. Yes. So camouflage is another defense. Mimicry is another common one. Right? So this is where you're mimicking toxic species to ward off predators. So one type of this mimicry is Batesian mimicry, right? And this is where a species that is not toxic, right, will mimic the toxic colors of a toxic species, right? So if we look at the scarlet king snake, right, this snake here, this one is toxic, right? It has this red and white and black coloration. This eastern coral snake, right, is not a toxic species. Right? But it's kind of mimicking those same essential colors as the toxic species. Right? Now this is different from the other type of mimicry you can see, which is Mullerian mimicry. Right? And this is where both species are toxic and they show the same type of coloration. Right? This is an example of convergent evolution. So Remember convergent evolution, one of our evidences for evolution occurring, right, was species that do not have a common ancestor develop similar traits. Right? You can see this in the coloration of a lot of individuals. So both of these butterflies are unpalatable, right? They are toxic, and they have the same type of coloration to warn off predators. Right? If we look at other mimics, right, and lots of examples of this in nature, these wasps and these bees are another example of this type of mimicry here. And they have all these same colorations, right? Yellow and black, right? Kind of these striped patterns. And so it's reinforcing this warning color pattern to predators. Right? By having that same coloration, it's just reinforcing that to the predators to say, don't eat me. All right, we can have displays of intimidation. Right? We're going to deceive the predator about how easy it might be to eat them. Right? So this porcupine fish will blow up into this large balloon. I'm sure you've seen this in cartoon shows. It's a pretty common example. I don't know if you can see with the lights here, but we have this owl kind of puffing itself up to show, make it look like it's bigger than it actually is. Right? Same with this lizard. It's kind of puffing up its, I don't even know the technical term of this, kind of like its ear region, right? To make it look bigger than it actually is. There's armor and weaponry, right? So turtle shells are a good example of this. Beetle exoskeletons, bear claws. This is a grizzly bear claw. You can see how huge and massive they actually are. Right? For plants, they might develop thorns and spines, like this honey locust. Right? This honey locust actually has a really cool evolutionary history. Right? It has these huge thorns on the tree trunk. And those were actually evolved to ward off herbivores like the woolly mammoth. Right? The woolly mammoth would eat the leaves of the honey locust. So it created this evolutionary arms race where we had these giant thorns evolve. Right? Now, obviously, we don't have any woolly mammoths now, right? But we still have these honey locusts with these large thorns on them. All right, I want you to think about this question. Right? Most animal defense techniques do not involve hand-to-hand combat or paw-to-paw combat. Right? Why would this be? Right? Everything we've talked about so far, they haven't been physically fighting each other for most of our examples. Yeah, that's what I said. It's a hard question. About maybe, you never know. hand-to-hand or paw-to-paw combat. Yeah, it's a lot of energy to put into fighting. Yeah, that could be another. Yeah, it's just safer to avoid any conflict from happening. Do you have any other answers? We're thinking of one? Right. We were talking about like the bunny and the predator situation over here, right? If you're a bunny, you're likely not to have combat with your predator because you just haven't evolved those mechanisms that allow you to be able to win that fight, right? So a lot of times combat, right, will result in injuries or even death. And if an animal gets injured, it's going to affect how they survive, right? They're going to bleed, right? They're going to have wounds that they have to heal. And when they're wounded, they're not going to be able to find food as easily. Maybe they're not able to move as far. Maybe they're not able to evade the next predation attack, right? So rather avoid confrontation, all right, than expend all that energy and risks involved in that combat. All right, so predators, they have major effects on the environment, right? And so this can be illustrated by invasive species. We talked about the Burmese pythons when we talked about populations and how they have this huge exponential growth when they are introduced to the Florida Everglades here, right? But because they have no natural predators, right, they have caused massive environmental destruction, right? Major decline in wildlife. Not only the small animals like raccoons and possums, but like wild white-tailed deer or bobcats, right? Even their numbers are significantly down 94% or 87%. So massive impacts on the environment, right? Another example of this would be the prickly pear cactus, right? So this is a plant example, which you never have too many plant examples, right? So the prickly pear cactus was introduced to Australia, and it became a pest. All right, so in rangelands, and I'll dim the light so you can see this black and white picture, right? In rangelands, it grew so abundantly, right, that cattle couldn't graze without getting injured or have any room to move, right? These cacti were a huge major pest. So what they did was they introduced this small cactus moth, which the larvae feeds on the prickly pear. And as a result of introducing that predator, right, they got the prickly pear population under control, right, and saved hundreds of thousands of acres of rangeland. Yes? It could. And it's one of the things when we do these biological introductions like this, right, to control another species, a lot of tests are done beforehand to make sure it's not going to have unintended consequences down the road. I'll say that this was done kind of in an era where they were less concerned about that. They were more concerned about the immediate problem. But even today, we use some biological control mechanisms, and there's a lot of study behind that before we introduce a new species to the environment, because it could have other unintended consequences. Yeah, great question. All right, I'm going to skip this thought question here of what other examples of a species interaction could affect our society, and go on to our last slide here, because I want us to have time for that content check. Right? Just reiterates that not all species interactions are bad. Right? We can have mutualisms, right, where both of them benefit. Like pollination is such a great example of mutualisms. Right? Plant is getting pollinated, bee is getting the nectar. Right? This commensalism is when one member benefits, but the other is not affected. Right? So for example, here we might have seed dispersal by these barbed seeds. Right? The seeds are benefiting in that they are being dispersed when they're clung onto the fur of some individual. Right? But even though it's a nuisance, right, and it's not fun to have barbs on you, right, it's really not negatively impacting that species' survivorship in any way. All right, So I want to end here before we go to the content check. Homework for Monday, right? It is none. But that scientific literacy assignment is due on Wednesday. I have scheduled another study session next Wednesday, so keep that in mind and keep working on that study guide. All right,